is so wonderful to see everybody's face that's here celebrating the life of Bob. Robert B., Dr. Robert, can you not hear me, Chris?
Are you okay?
Can you hear me? Everybody hear me? Okay. All right, anyway, thanks once again for coming. I'm sure you're all here because Bob has deeply touched your heart in some way. Okay, sorry, I have somebody up here telling me what to do. My name is Christina Morton, and I'm honored to be able to be called a friend to Bob. Bob was a very dear friend to me, and according to his daughter Roberta, she just told me that I was his girlfriend. We had lots of fun times together, and my love for Bob actually started when I was a little girl, and I used to watch House with the Magic Window that his dear friend Joy Munn started, and then it was passed on to Betty Lou, and I used to love when Bob would come onto the set and bring critters. And then it was fun later on. It's so funny how life, it just works in such mysterious ways that when you're a little girl, and to not even think that later on that you would be helping someone who touched you in such a deep way. But Bob, he told me a couple of stories about life with Betty Lou, going to WHO, and the time that the bees got loose in the WOI, I'm sorry, WOI. And another time he was showing little kids how to preserve spider webs, and he accidentally sprayed the spray paint through the web, and it actually sprayed on Betty Lou. On her black hair, yes. And he said she was so gracious, but who could ever get mad at Bob? I just can't imagine ever being mad at Bob. One of the ways that Bob also touched my life was he was so humble, and I'm sure that you've all known how humble he is. He used to talk sometimes about World War II, and he really never felt like he did much for service. But he was so important of keeping the soldiers safe and going in ahead of time and making sure that they weren't going to get sick from malaria and different diseases. And he once told me about a time that he stumbled upon a woman who was out in the field that a soldier was going to shoot, and he actually stopped that from happening. And I said, Bob, you saved a life. And he didn't even, I don't think he even got it until I said that out loud to him. And he didn't think that he saved a life because he felt that he could have done a little bit more. But he did. He saved this woman's life. And his humbleness really touched me. And Bob was such a caring, caring man. He was always for the underdog, and he loved to work with kids in the yard and teach them things. He had a few kids that were foster children that had never even picked up a garden tool in their life or knew a weed from a flower, and he would teach them. He was so caring and so giving in so many ways, and I would love to just be able to hear all the stories that all of you have about Bob, but we're here to have a few people talk about how important he is and how he's touched their lives. I know I miss him. I used to be able to see him every Thursday at 1:30, and every Thursday at 1:30 now there's a big hole in my heart. So one of the things that Bob really, really loved was giving, and he chose two charities before he passed that he would like people to remember. One of them is the Emergency Residence Project, and I know that Bob gave money, and he always worried about all the men in the shelter and keeping them warm and keeping them fed. So that's one of his charities. And the other charity is the Iowa Wildlife Center. And that is very near and dear to his heart, and I know that he doesn't feel that it gets enough attention. So he really would like people to hear about these two charities. So we are going to have both of them speak, and we're going to start with Vic Moss from the Emergency Residence Project. Thank you, Vic.
Thank you. It's a sad state of affairs when you have to learn most of what you know about a person by reading in their obituary. And I saw Bob many, many times. I mean, many a times. In fact, every winter he would call our son Chris in the last few years and want to donate something to help people. So a lot of people stayed warm because of all the long johns that he donated. And I mean, the actual effect of that, you know, it's hard to imagine. But if you don't have shelter, that's really what you should be doing. Anyway, but and then many, many meals too. I remember those hams that we had. So anyway, but I guess first thing you said about not knowing very well is because it was never about him. He never talked about himself. It was about my work. I knew a little bit. I knew he'd been a professor at Iowa State because I was an undergraduate in entomology when he was a professor in that area. But I didn't have the good fortune of ever having him as an instructor. But I know probably the best thing I can think about him is all of the young people that he kind of instilled a love for the natural world. Even though I worked on social issues almost all my career, that was my solace in having some background and people like him to encourage other people to go and do that. I can't think of a better thing to say about a person. But anyway, thank you.
And now I'll introduce Marlene Arisman from the Iowa Wildlife Center. Thank you.
The one thing I love about events like this, celebrations of life, is how it brings so many of the people that are near and dear to my heart together. Some of you I don't know, some of you I've only heard of, some of you I know very well, and Bob was one of those people. So Chris and I have shared tears, and that's okay because when you love somebody, like I know Chris and Jim and Roberta and the rest of the family loved him and his friends loved him, yeah, we're good. Are you going to hand that to me? One moment. Thank you. So I first knew of Bob back in the 1980s, and I was a volunteer wildlife rehabilitator. I'm going to get the podium all wet, so excuse me. And my husband and I and a young veterinarian started the Iowa Wildlife Rehabilitators Association. And we had statewide conferences teaching other rehabilitators about wildlife and how to help wildlife. And it was a complex, complicated, new, young profession, and we needed some mentors in our young and growing profession, and Bob Moorman was one of them. I could call him back in the 80s and talk to him about wildlife and what to do with some problems that people were having with wildlife issues, and he was always taking the time with me. And so our relationship started early, and it was sporadic, I have to say, and it wasn't until we moved to Ames. I was a student at Iowa State, went back to school when I was in my 40s, for heaven's sakes, and we moved to Ames, wow, I don't know when that was. Oh, my husband remembers everything. 1992, and so it was from that point on that I started getting to know Bob again. And then, about 12 years ago, I'll look at him again, we moved to Brook Ridge.
Well, 2006.
Okay, 2006. And it turns out that Bob Moorman was one of our neighbors, and I was so excited. And so we got to know each other all over again and just continued to the relationship. So, and it was about then that we developed the Iowa Wildlife Center, and it's a nonprofit wildlife rehabilitation, conservation, education, and wildlife assistance skills training organization. And those three things fit Bob to a T. He loved to educate people. He loved to see us making sure that other people understood our role in the natural world and how to interact with it. And Bob, when Bob was coming up through the years, he didn't always deal with wildlife issues that Jim Pease would get calls of in extension following Bob, or that my husband Bruce got calls and as his role in the DNR as a wildlife biologist. People are always calling about problems with wildlife. And so now we talk about how we can live among wildlife and interact with them in a more positive way, because we're actually on their turf, right? And so knowing that our turf really ends at our door, they stay outside and we're inside, but learning how to live among them in a more positive way. Bob didn't always deal with them in a positive way because the profession didn't teach him that early on. And so one thing that we loved to talk about was bats. And so I brought a bat with me. I could have brought a live one, and I thought, maybe not. but so I brought this little one. And Chris would bring him. In the summertime, we would get baby bats in June. Baby bats are insectivorous. Bats give birth in June, and so a lot of times we get babies in, and for various reasons, and we need to raise them and release them and things. Every time he got wind that we had a new bat in, Chris has brought him driving down the alley, pulling into our yard, and Chris would say, "Marlene, can you let Dad see the bats?" And so I'd bring the bats out, and that would start a whole story about bats and all of the different ways that Bob interacted with just bat species. And one way he interacted back then is if they were in your attic, he would fumigate. If he couldn't get them out, they would fumigate the bats. And he always felt horrible about that. But that's what was done back then, and that's one reason he loves what we're doing, because we've learned now, we learned from those people of our past that there are new ways to deal with things. And Bob was one of those people that learned every day and was okay with saying, that's the way I did it and I feel bad, and now we move on to a new and better way of dealing with it. So Bob's spirit of learning continued until the day he died. And that was the one thing I adored about him, and the one thing I will take away from that is being happy to learn. One thing, I always say that, one thing every day. So I expect somebody here today to teach me something. So please, I'd love to meet you, and I want to thank Chris and Jim and Roberta for bringing up their dad and caring for him in the way they did, because he was such a special man. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to introduce my husband now. He's a wildlife biologist with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and his relationship with Bob was different than mine. And he's also going to read a letter from somebody else that couldn't be here. That was a very special part of Bob's life as well. Bruce?
So I'm going to start right out. This is one of Bob's t-shirts that I really like. I'm a bird biologist, and it says, "Why can't we all just share?" It's got a squirrel in the middle, and squirrel was always the nemesis. That was one of the species that both of us had to deal with a lot of the time. I think I'll read this letter from, and I was the last graduate student of Dr. Jim Dinsmore, so there was a good relationship between Jim and Bob and I, and it was always nice when we could get together. So this is from Jim and Pat Dinsmore. They live in Villages, Florida, and it says, "Dear Chris, Jim, and Roberta, we were saddened to learn of your father's passing. He lived a long and full life and affected many people through his work with wildlife extension and the many organizations he was involved with. Jim first met Bob very briefly when he was an undergraduate at ISU in the early 1960s. Pat met Bob when we returned to Ames in 1975 and met him through various departmental activities. In the years since then, we were fortunate to have many opportunities to be with him and other members of your family. Bob was always the perfect gentleman, listening to others and sharing his thoughts with them. To be with Bob was not to hear a loud voice proclaiming his view, but to hear a quiet, reasoned conversation in which ideas could be shared. We especially enjoyed his stories about his earlier years, the people he interacted with, and the sense of history he always had. He was a fountain of information on wildlife, insects, and many other topics, and was always willing to share those ideas and memories with others. We greatly enjoyed the many dinners we shared with Bob, Ruth, and Chris over the years. We had lots of meals together at Cazador's and later at Lee's. They're always enjoyable and a time in which we got to know each other and have good times. After we moved south, we looked forward to sharing a meal with Bob whenever we returned to Ames, and more recently visiting him at Green Hills. He always was full of information. He's willing to share with others, something he did throughout his life. Jim mourns the fact that Bob apparently was the last of the old guard, a person whose career and knowledge spanned from the 1930s to the present, and his remembrance of some of the earliest players in the wildlife field up to the modern day times. He had a truly remarkable career, touched thousands of others through his work, and in many ways. We're sorry we're not able to be with you during this time of loss. We wanted you to know that Bob has a special place in our memories and in our hearts. We treasure those times that we were able to spend with this remarkable man. They were very special times. With all of our love, Pat and Jim Dinsmore. So as I mentioned, I first met Bob when I started my career with the Iowa DNR. I was with the, it was called the Living Resources Program, then it became the non-game program. It's now the Wildlife Diversity Program. But I just closed the wildlife exhibit in 1980 and closed the old game farm, and people were trying to figure out what they're going to do with me because I was in between positions at that point. And I was getting lots of phone calls from the public, and the same kind of calls that Jim has gotten, some kind of calls that Bob got about wildlife problems. Still, to this day, that still happens. But Bob was one of my early mentors. He was with that last year extension at the time, and we were dealing with kind of the same phone calls. And he always would give me great hints about how to deal with the animals and trying to save their lives for the most part with live trapping. And I can't remember some of the specifics, but I remember groundhogs in particular was one that he really helped me with. But I always appreciated his advice. He was always extremely humble and kind, and I'm definitely going to miss him. And the one thing that I always took away from him is he loved to learn, and that's something that I do too. So he had a big influence on me. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm Jim Pease. I was on Bruce's committee as well. So there are lots of cross relationships there. So, Chris, I have to tell you, I was going to bring a big pad of paper and say, well, Chris only gave me a few minutes, just to make you nervous, but I decided not to do that. When I returned to Iowa in 1980 to become a youth development specialist with the 4-H program, Bob and I became well acquainted because he was often at the many venues that I was at the Iowa 4-H camp, at the conservation camp, working with kids and providing a wonderful example for other staff to follow about how to work with children, how to touch their hearts and touch their minds, and their relationship with the outdoors. He reminded me, I got to know, at the same time, I got to know another mentor at the time was Cy Runkle, because they were around for that next 5 years at about the same time, and often at the same events. And it was wonderful seeing, as Jim Dinsmore said, the old guard, and seeing that sort of example I think they provided to the world about how to relate to other people and to the natural world. So he provided lots and lots of great examples, and we shared the teaching relationship for quite a few years. In 1986, the Department of Animal Ecology, which Bob was Extension Wildlife Specialist, asked me to take over part of that position, and it grew to finally a significant, about 60% of my appointment. But I was a bit apprehensive. I thought about it for a while because I thought taking over after Bob Moorman that's some pretty big shoes to fill. And I knew that I could never fill them, but I might fill the position and try to do some things differently. Bob had been in that position, I think it was 35 or 36 years, and the numbers vary depending on who you talk to, but he had been in that position, and he was certainly a major force across the state. Everybody seemed to know him. He seemed to know everybody, and he, for 35 years, he had provided that service to the people of Iowa. He had a very strong relationship not only with the Department of Animal Ecology, but also with the Department of Entomology for his dual interests there. And I know he spent an awful lot of time, coffee breaks over in the insectary with the likes of Donald Lewis and several of the rest of you. So Bob was, over my subsequent 24 years as Extension Wildlife Specialist, Bob was a mentor. He and Ruth would come to many of the programs that I gave, and they were always, I could always depend on at least two people showing up, because Bob and Ruth would show up. And often then Chris would come along, so it was very nice to have an audience. And Bob provided me, as he has with so many people, lots of advice, but only when I asked for it. He didn't try to put his ideas in, but when I would ask for his advice, he would willingly give it, and regaled me, as he has many of you, with stories, particularly things that he used to do with DDT. It's amazing he lived to be 100. It really is. So it's quite remarkable. So Bob was a mentor and a friend for all those years since I came back to Iowa in 1980, and I will, as will all of you, I know will miss him. Thank you to the family for sharing him so willingly with the people of Iowa.
Before I introduce the family, I just wanted to share another little tidbit. I don't know whether any of you know this, but one of the things that Bob shared with me is that he never, ever in his life applied for a job. He said that he always had phone calls that led him from this place to that place to that place. And hearing you all speak, you can see why. What a wonderful person. His family was so lucky to have him. And speaking of family, the family would like to talk. His daughter Roberta and his son Jim and his daughter Chris are here, and we're going to start with Roberta. She has some remarks she would like to talk about with you all about her father.
Okay, my speech has a couple themes. Dad felt very strongly about mothers. He thought they were the most wonderful people in the world. So happy Mother's Day to everyone. Dad was my hero. He was truly a good man, loving, caring, and giving. He often said, if you want to know the quality of a man, look at the paths he has taken. I asked Mom why she chose Dad, and she said she admired what he stood for, integrity. I asked Dad why he chose Mom. He said he knew she'd be a good mother. When we were children, many orphaned animals came to live with us. Foxes, squirrels, skunks. In fact, when Mom was married 6 months, Dad brought some skunks home, called them kits, and mistakenly she thought they were kittens. Dad said we should take care of these animals because they had no mothers. We were told not to touch them very much so they wouldn't bond with us. We fed them with doll baby bottles. When they were a little older, he would take the baby animals to schools and camps and teach children how to treat them. Foxes were my favorite. I called one Melody. Dad said, that's no name for a fox. One night I snuck a fox in my bed and I got fleas. At school, None of the kids would sit next to me. They said I had cooties. I told them to get it right. I had fleas. As a child, I thought Dad knew everything. Stars, trees, flowers, rocks, birds, animal tracks. Amazing. These were some of the things he taught me. 1, all life is precious. 2, all plants and animals have a purpose. 3, everyone and everything has rules to follow. 4, flowers don't bloom at the same time, they take turns. 5, each animal has a predator. If that animal dies, you get a population explosion. If the other dies, sometimes the predator dies too. 6, if an environment changes, such as after a tornado, sometimes birds end up where they would never be. 7, all life is connected. No animal or person lives alone. 8, be a carrot. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I was searching for the reason and the purpose for my life. I talked to Dad about it. He told me I worried too much and I should just be a carrot. I didn't understand what he meant. He said carrots don't say I wish I was a radish. They just go about being a carrot. That's what I needed to do. I brought a friend home, Don, to meet the parents. Don wanted to be a wildlife specialist, so Dad taught him a lesson. We went to the ledges for a picnic. Time after time, Mom would say, this looks like a good spot to eat. Dad would say, I'll choose a better spot. Finally, he stopped. It was surrounded by litter. He told my friend Don, if you want to be a wildlife specialist, you pick up litter. Get started. People would call him about foxes in the hen house, bats in the attic, skunks under the porch. This is what he would say to people. Foxes were probably hungry. Bats wanted shelter, and the skunk probably had babies. He would tell them he would come out and help, but he would also say, leave that mama skunk alone. They are fierce. An interesting story about snakes. Safe snakes are really, and should really, look like big worms. Big but hard to see. He taught me 5 rules about snakes. Are you ready? If its head is really big, leave it alone. It may be a copperhead. 2, if the snake's tail is big and makes a sound, leave it alone. It's probably a rattler. 3, if it's brightly colored and has rings, it's a coral snake. Leave it alone. You get in the picture? If it's a big bull snake and as big as your arm and heading for your house, shoot it. Well, really, leave it alone. As a child, I was always scared of spiders. Dad tried his best to get me to like them. Here are his reasons why they are amazing. Are you ready? 1, they make cobwebs. Can you do that? 2, they walk with 8 legs and they don't trip. 3, they eat bugs and help with mosquitoes. 4, they are the first food for their children. One summer I worked at Camp Wapaton in Waverly, Iowa. I called Dad and said there were spiders as big as my hand. I was nature counselor. Help, Dad, help! Dad told me they had a special kind of spider. He'd tell the kids all about it. This spider carried its egg sac on her back until the babies hatched. 2 legs on each side, and it walked with 4 legs. Well, some of the kids agreed that the spider was amazing. Others just wanted them out of their tents. Last but not least, Nina the badger. Almost everybody knew about Nina, and you probably have better stories than me. Nina came to Dad because a student found her wet and alone in a drainage ditch. Do I have that right, Chris? No, I don't. Okay. Dad nursed her back to life using doll baby bottles. She followed him everywhere. In the morning, they would go for walks. If Dad got too far ahead or too far behind, she would, what he called, worry him. Scolding and chittering. Dad would answer back. Finally, she was too big to stay and too used to people to return to the woods. He took her to the conservation zoo at the Ledges. We went back to see her, Dad and me. Dad made a badger sound and she came over to the fence and they chattered back and forth. Then a big grunt came out of the enclosure and a huge male badger showed up. She finally had a boyfriend. She looked at Dad one more time, then headed over to the male. You know what Dad said? Badgers have no loyalty. And I said, but Dad, you aren't a male badger.
As somebody's already said, many of us have stories that the others haven't heard. I hadn't heard all of that, I heard part of it. Sometimes we don't truly appreciate people until they're gone, and sometimes it's the quietest ones and the gentlest ones who have the biggest impact in our life. My dad was one of those folks. I'd like to share with you some of the ways in which he's changed my life and those of my family and others around him, as others have also said the same thing. As a fisheries and wildlife specialist, it was only natural that as a little toddler and growing up, Dad had a fishing pole in my hand at a very early age. When our son Aaron was old enough to hold a pole, he had him out at a farm pond too, holding the pole and catching fish. It wasn't that long ago that he had our daughter Elizabeth out in a boat in Paul Reedhead's pond catching whopper, largemouth bass. Everybody's had that experience, or if they haven't, they're missing out on a big part of life. It wasn't that many years ago that Elizabeth was out catching fish, and so it was only natural that our grandson, his great-grandson, was out catching fish at Hayden Reservoir last year. We have a picture of Dad and RJ holding that fish. So we have the generation set of pictures, and it's truly something that we are glad to have. You know that he was working with kids. Every summer it seemed like he was out at some youth camp mapping out nature trails and teaching kids to identify birds and animal footprints and trees and flowers. We grew up being exposed to the outdoors and everything that was alive. A big part of our life for many, many years was summers out in the Colorado Rocky Mountain Park area. Through the generosity of his longtime office partner, some of you may remember, Harold Gunderson, we were able to stay in their summer cabin for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, hiking the trails, feeding the hummingbirds by hand, seeing the deer go by the cabin, learning some of the birds that we didn't get to see in our home, and becoming very familiar with the bird books, learning how to identify the birds. You heard the story a little bit about Dad and WOI. Let me tell you my side of WOI. Through Dad's frequent occurrences at WOI, he became pretty good friends with the station's chief engineer and the AM/FM broadcast engineer, and wrangled me a job as I was 14, and being a broadcast engineer, that sustained me for 14 or 15 years, in and out as a part-time guy, running sound, turned into a lifetime of volunteer work at our church doing audiovisual, and through that background, our wonderful daughter-in-law sucked me into doing musical theater. And so for the past 10 years, I've had the extreme joy of helping kids as part of productions, the middle school kids, that is just, mountaintop experience, helping them to be heard and to support them and see them grow from 6th to 7th to 8th grade as they progress, developing their skills. None of this would have happened without that first introduction that Dad made for me. When I was in kindergarten, in between kindergarten and 3rd grade, Dad had a short-time job for a couple of years that I was at Kansas State in fisheries biology. And
part of that job was helping farmers with farm ponds that had troubles. So during the summer when I wasn't in school, I would be with him in the car and we would be out visiting farm ponds. I can remember him and a partner seining a pond and having a collection of all of the life that was in that pond, where there was crayfish and bullfrogs and snapping turtles and all the rest of the fish species. And then seeing some of the interaction between those creatures that were all of a sudden in a net together. And there were some life experiences learned there. There was a bullfrog that ate a live crayfish. I was really sorry he did that. There was a snapping turtle that took a huge chunk out of the oar. So you stay away from dangerous critters, and you don't let your eyes get bigger than your stomach, right? You heard that he did some trapping and capturing of animals, and so it was only natural that that progressed down the family tree or up the tree or however it goes. So I learned to trap, live trap and move, and there's been many a skunk and a possum and a squirrel that have been in the back of my car and relocated to better hunting grounds. And bats. We moved 4 bats from the church, and every one was a different species. I described them to Dad. He said, "Oh, that's a little brown. Oh, that's the big brown." So you just don't realize how much you learn. And I think you mentioned that learning something every day, and that has been my motto. And I don't feel satisfied unless I learn something new every day. And I think that's part of being alive. It helps you know that you're still alive if you're learning something new. Dad encouraged me to take things apart. He seemed to always be showing up with some piece of old electronics. When I was, I don't know, 13 or 14, something like that, I was discovering amateur radio and electronics. His brother, Max, worked for the utility company, and he was an amateur hobbyist, and soon was sending me parts and diagrams and things to build. That turned into my end-up career as a double E at Motorola, a lifetime being an amateur radio operator, and supporting some of the things that just have been a key part of me, that through Dad, introductions, and family, it was just something that we have a lot of bird feeders in our backyard. We feed a lot of birds. As a result of that, I learned that there are predators. So when Elizabeth comes home from school in the wintertime and sees a circle of feathers out in the yard, we have to figure out what's going on. And soon we began to watch, and now we see those goshawks swooping through at treetop levels. And there'll be 50 birds out on the feeders, and then all of a sudden there's hours with nothing. And then pretty soon we hear the crows cawing, and we know the hawks are out there in the trees. And you never would have known that unless you were exposed to it through somebody like Dad. Something that we just forget about, and then we realize after someone is gone how much of an impact they had in our lives. Thanks to Dad, I learned to enjoy nature, pass that on to our family. That unseen larvae that's under the water is as much part of the food chain as the largest animal that's at the top of the food chain. That great horned owl that sits on top of my radio tower several times in a week and hoots out its territory from 10 to 11. We know it's a great horned owl. We go out there and I told Dad about that. When that happens, I said, you know, Dad did research on owls. There's a link there. There's always a cause and effect. There's something going on that brings out that part of our lives that we have so much to be thankful for, from the tiny field mouse that we trapped and brought it into the house, and soon we had a litter of baby field mouse. And that became a little project for Elizabeth at school. Aaron can tell you about the snapping turtle that Dad sent him home with that went to school. How many kids have that in their background and that opportunity? Thanks to Dad, we're so much better off. We love you, Dad.
There's going to be just a touch of repetition because we didn't know exactly what each one of us was going to say, so here it goes. When we were growing up, we were sure that we had the best backyard for kids in the entire Brook Ridge neighborhood, and likely in the whole Roosevelt School part of Ames. It was fenced in on 3 sides, and in addition to the large vegetable garden and beautifully planted flower borders, it was filled with many childhood delights. My brother built a tree house in the apple tree, off limits to little sisters, and there was a big sandbox, a little log cabin playhouse, and the bestest ever swing on one of the 4 tall white oak trees. And if you snuck in underneath the big blue spruce, there was a mysterious circle of stones and shells in the ground that we were certain was where the fairies danced tonight. We were around the corner from Brookside Park with all of its playground equipment, trails, a swinging bridge, and the tennis courts, which back then were flooded in the winter for ice skating. We helped Mom with turning apples into pies, canning tomatoes, and in the winter we made snow ice cream out of freshly fallen snow. One way or another, we spent a lot of our childhood days outside. Add to that a father whose specialty was teaching about the natural world, and boy did we have it good. We learned so many things: how to catch butterflies in a net without tearing up the wings, how to hold little tree frogs in our hands, how not to be scared of garter snakes and centipedes and big green caterpillars. We laughed at the squirrels chattering so loudly as they chased each other all over the fences and trees. We learned all of the backyard birds and helped keep their feeders in the bird bath full. We were fascinated to watch the raccoons, squirrels, rabbits, possums, and the many other critters that happened into our backyard oasis. In the summer, when the badminton net was strung up, Dad would set up bright lights to shine on it so we could see the nighttime moths up close. The giant Prometheus, the beautiful and huge pale green Luna, and so many others we didn't see during the day. We learned how the cicadas made that constant, so loud noise, and why there seemed to be so many of them in certain summers. And in the fall, we raked tons of oak leaves into a pile 12 feet around and 3 feet high, sometimes with the help of neighbor kids, and then we took turns standing on the swing and jumping off into the pile. So much fun. Dad took us fishing and taught us how to catch earthworms and put them squirming on the hook. He showed us how to catch dozens of fireflies in a jar, and how to squish off the lit up body and press it onto your finger to make a ring. Heck, nobody else had a dad who knew how to do cool stuff like that. We learned how to paddle a canoe and how to hunt for morel mushrooms, and probably most important of all, how to identify poison ivy. Dad hunted game birds when I was little, and I will never forget the time when I was in 1st grade, and probably thinking that he had come up with a terribly clever idea of an interesting thing for me to take to show and tell the next day, called me down to the basement where he was cleaning a pheasant. And what was this wonderful object that he has taken extra time and effort to fashion for me, and that he was so delighted in explaining to me how to show it off to a room full of 6-year-olds? Yes, indeed. He had carefully carved off the outside of the lower part of the pheasant's leg, exposing the tendons, so that by pulling on them you could make the toes clench up. Oh boy. Mom thought it was disgusting, but yes, I did take it to show and tell. Or the time he came back from some field trip or other conservation education outing and set down a burlap bag out at the back door. Until Mom saw it and thought better of it and demanded to know what was in the bag. So when Dad said that it was just a ball snake, I can still hear Mom not so calmly tell him in no uncertain terms, "Bob, get that snake out of here." While Dad spent most of the weeks of each summer with other people's kids, at camps run by 4-H, the Scouts, churches, and the like, there was always time for a family vacation to somewhere out of doors. In 1963, we went on our first big trip out west with our neighbors Wallace and Edna Ogg, who showed us Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons. Then for every summer after that, we spent 2 weeks at the cabin of an old office mate of Dad's, 8,600 feet up in the Rockies just south of Estes Park. We fished in the mountain streams, hiked the trails in the park, and marveled at the Continental Divide up on top of Traverse Road. And through it all, there was Dad, sharing his vast knowledge with us about the beauty and wonders of nature, always in easy-to-understand ways, so we never felt like we were being taught lessons that we would have to hold on to for a lifetime. We had a ball. Growing up, of course I knew that other kids had dads who took them fishing and on family road trips, and who maybe played a lot of sports with them that our dad didn't do. But I didn't realize that not everybody had a parent who knew stuff, the same as our dad did. I just assumed that most folks had a healthy understanding of the importance of nature in all its parts. It wasn't until I hit Chicago in the mid-70s that I started to get it, that an awful lot of people had next to no clue about the natural world at all, and that what I had learned growing up meant that I could grasp what was happening to our natural resources and they, for the most part, just didn't. They just never had the experiences that we'd had. Most of the people I met or worked with had virtually no connectedness with nature. To them, a city park or the lakefront beach or a golf course was enough. Then in 1988, I heard a program on what was happening in the National Forest of the Pacific Northwest, given by the best conveyor of nature information that I'd ever heard, and something just snapped inside of me. After meeting this incredible guy and getting hooked up with his forest activist colleagues in Oregon, quite suddenly it all seemed to come together for me. My growing up in a conservation household, which had imbued me with a deep love of nature that I guess I just never fully acknowledged until that moment. And I can say that a new path started for me that very day. And at the age of 35, I began to understand my life's direction was meant to be as Bob Moorman's daughter. Over the next several years, while still working for a living in downtown Chicago, I embarked on a journey that surprised me sometimes. As the regional representative with the Native Forest Council in Eugene, Oregon, I immersed myself in one of the hottest environmental issues of that time, the fight to protect old-growth timber on federal lands and the critical habitat that those ever smaller parcels contained. I got to work with internationally renowned environmental icons like David Brower, the legendary archdruid of the Sierra Club, and promoted him and many other speakers. I got pulled into the steering committee of the 20th anniversary of Earth Day 1990 in Chicago and ended up running about a quarter of all the activities for a crowd that numbered over 140,000. I was able to connect Bill McDonough, one of the world's leading eco-architects, with unknown to him sources of sustainably managed forest products, among many other exciting projects with Bill. Being Bob Moorman's daughter was really making more sense. I often took my vacation time to go with Mom and Dad to the annual March meetings of the National Wildlife Federation, as Dad was always the delegate from the Iowa affiliate. At these meetings, I met many people who would become central to what I was later able to help accomplish. People who returned my phone calls, trusted me maybe more than they might have some of the national organization's professional lobbyists on forest issues. And at the top of my list of unique contacts was the new chief of the Forest Service in 1997, Mike Dombeck, who had gotten his PhD in fisheries at ISU from Bruce Menzel and remembered Dad in the years before he retired. It was through that connection and some other similar introductions that I was able to play a significant part in the change of federal policy procedures on the exploding issue of land exchanges of Forest Service lands. During all those years, I'd tell Dad what I was doing, keeping him up to date on the successes and failures, and once or twice he told me he was proud of me. I'm only recounting these things that I was involved with because they simply would not have happened otherwise. There are too many other stories to tell today of how the teachings I had absorbed from my dad came around full circle in making me more effective in the work that I had now come to do. Dad was the quiet educator, and I became the fierce advocate. I have no doubt at all that the drive for the righteous cause of nature came from one wellspring, because I had grown up as Bob Moorman's daughter, and now I was paying it back. In 1995, Mom had a massive stroke after quintuple bypass surgery and was hospitalized for 6 months. Dad and I knew that our lives were going to change, but neither of us were prepared for quite how much. Mom was half paralyzed, but we took her every week to get her hair done and twice a month each to her PEO and Packley Women's Club meetings, and we hauled her out to eat every few weeks. We were simply exhausted on so many days, but it was so worth it. It's the most important thing I've ever done, and I know Dad felt the same. So when Dad summed up the experience after she passed away in 2000 by saying, "We had it pretty easy with your mother," it was really true. Because though she was greatly incapacitated, she was always happy. And since she had no concept of her physical deficits, she was always wanting to put on a dinner party or play the piano or go out dancing. And so many caregivers we knew of had so much tougher a road than we did. And when at the exact same time that we lost Mom, I was diagnosed with a disease that has taken over my legs, Dad took on the task of driving me to all my umpteen leg therapy sessions and helped me adjust to life on the first floor in Mom's converted den room, since there was no possibility of my returning to my beloved downtown Chicago. On occasion, I heard that he told people that we made a good team, and we began another chapter in our lives, now living together in the house on 9th Street, not a part of either of our life's plans. Dad always said, "You take care of me, and I'll take care of you." It was a pledge that neither one of us ever took lightly. So I ended up spending more time with my father than most adult children do, and I learned so much more about him and his life and work than I had any idea of beforehand. I counted myself so very lucky that I'd had this enormously special chance to care for and live with my parents like I did, and hard as it was, I'll treasure it always. In those days, Dad was happiest when he spent most of the day out in the yard, tending to every leaf or acorn that fell, and making sure that no twig or snowflake survived for long on his sidewalks or driveway. He enjoyed Kiwanis, always working the setup and takedown for pancake days, selling apples, and his favorite job helping Ken Larson run the sweet corn sales stand down by the bowling alley. He and his good friend Dwayne Mangold often went out on outings that sometimes included fishing, but almost always ended up at Brecky's for popcorn and birdseed, usually followed by stopping somewhere for hot chocolate. And when the time came that Dad really needed a different living arrangement and care than I and our house were best able to give him, he moved out to a brand new assisted living apartment at Green Hills in 2012. He always had said that he just wanted to die out in the woods or the backyard. Translation, not in some facility. But he did come to enjoy the camaraderie he found out there. Dad's fingers had become more and more affected by neuropathy, and he couldn't handle shirt buttons anymore, so we switched him over to t-shirts full time. He had lots of fun picking out which one he'd wear that day. Let's see, will it be SOB, Sweet Old Bob, or the Birds of the Prairies, or one of the funny Ulster shirts like, I'm the oldest, I make the rules. He got such a kick out of showing off his latest new shirt to the ladies at the Linden's dining room, and especially had fun with them with the young staff who took care of his needs. The huge collection eventually grew to over 130 shirts in total. You'll see a few of his very favorite ones here today on the memory table. I also brought along a half dozen squirrel t-shirts for anyone who'd like to take home a memento of Bob today. They're on the table right around the corner to the right, and I honestly would like people to take them today. One of the last outside public events I took Dad to was for one of his favorite charities, Youth and Shelter Services, on the occasion of the retirement of its founder, George Bolitzos, 2 years ago. Dad and I attended an event for donors held under tents at George's farm. Since YSS was eventually to get a small request, I asked Dad if he'd like to just give the check directly to George that day. So when I called George over to our table, Dad had the check in hand, looked him in the eye and said, "You were supposed to get this after I died, but I'm not dead yet." And we all had a good laugh with that one. As he crept up in age, Dad never lost his extra large capacity for kindness, for showing gratitude to each and every person who assisted him in any way. And even though he got more weary and wore out more easily, he still could be counted on to participate in many activities. When people remarked on his being 100 years old, he'd smile and tell them, "Well, the devil wasn't ready to take me yet." But one day in March, he woke up and decided that it was now his time to go. He'd had enough. And in 40 hours, he was gone. And isn't that what we all want, to go out of this life under our own steam? Dad left many legacies behind him. His 3 kids, 2 grandchildren, and a great-grandson, of course. But more than that, he'd made an unforgettable impression on thousands upon thousands of people all over the state, young and old alike. Whether he was showing a young kid how Solomon Seal got its name, or leading a hike in the woods, or advising someone halfway across the state on how to take care of some pesky critter on their property, or identifying a bird flying up high in the sky by just the color and shape of its tail feathers, Dad always enjoyed sharing his bountiful knowledge with those around him. And too will remember Dad's favorite things: trilliums and Mayapples in the spring, birds for trefoil in the summer, feeding hummingbirds and cardinals, A&W root beer and chicken Kiev, the Red Green Show, and MASH. There weren't many like him, that's for sure. He's gone now, but his contributions to conservation education will live on in the lives he touched so gently, as will his kindness and generosity of spirit. Thanks, Dad, for everything you gave us. You inspired all our lives.
This concludes a memorial service for Bob, and we would like to ask all of you to come back to the back and chat with the family and have refreshments and take fellowship and share stories, and thank you for coming. It means so much, as Bob meant so much to all of us.
Right.